Hey everybody, it's Friday again, and today we are going to pick up with chapter 2. Uh, Still in the same region of the world. We're just moving ahead a little bit into some of the later early civilizations. Uh, got the news this week that our intention is to come back to school at least on an AB schedule starting September 28th. Uh, That'll give us 1 week of AB before we go on fall break, and then have a week off, and then come back to school and hopefully really finally start to get into the swing of things. Uh, you know, I would like to have covered a little more in this time, and we still have another week, but I think it puts us, consider all things considered, I think it puts us in a good position for where we'll be when you all do come back into the classroom here. Let me get rolling here with the, yes, I am drinking Kool-Aid jam. Let's see. Chapter 2, the ancient Near East, people and empires of that region. Now, like I said, we are basically picking up same region of the world. We're expanding out a little bit, but same region of the world, but we're starting to hit the later civilizations that developed in Mesopotamia, in the Near East, and laying the foundation for, as we get into the next unit, chapters 3 and 4, the second unit will both be about the Greek world. And by the time we finish this chapter up here, we are setting the stage and opening the door for the Greeks. Now, here on the first slide, chapter 2 starts talking about the Hebrew people. And if you notice up here in the very first line, I say that the Hebrews are a Semitic-speaking people whose tradition Semitic-speaking people whose tradition concerning their origins, talks about them in the Old Testament. You hear Semitic anytime you might hear reference to people of the Jewish faith. If someone is doing or saying something against the Jewish faith or the Jewish people, you might hear them referred to as anti-Semitic or an anti-Semite. I've already mentioned the Semitic people. This region, it would have come from, modern day Israel, Palestine, all the way up into Syria. If you look at the maps in chapter 1, when I talked about King Sargon and the kingdom of Akkad, or the Akkadians, they were the first, remember, Sargon was the first king to bring the Sumerian cities all together under one rule. Where they had always been independent city-states, the kingdom of Akkad ends up absorbing the city-states throughout Sumer, and that all, it grows his kingdom. The ancestors of the Hebrew people, the Hebrews were descendants of those early Akkadians. They were also a Semitic-speaking people. Now, the descendants of Abraham, they actually move from the Mediterranean region, like I said, southern Turkey, Syria, a little farther down. Eventually, they will resettle in Israel. But the descendants of Abraham, they pack up, they move to the east, they moved from Mesopotamia to the area of Palestine. From this point forward, they're going to be referred to as the children of Israel. The kingdom of Israel will start to take shape, but that's a little farther down the line. What happens is drought and this is a very arid region of the world. Drought in Palestine ends up driving the Israelites out of Palestine. They just continue pushing farther and farther south until they find some place that is more hospitable, easier to grow crops, which, like I said, this entire region, not to say that it's a wasteland, it's not, but it can be very inhospitable depending on where you're at. And one place that's always going to be very, very forgiving in this region is going to be the Nile Delta. So the Israelites end up moving so far south, and of course, if you know the Old Testament, the story of Moses, all about the Hebrew people and their plight in Egypt. Well, what happens is, and again, the Israelites, they ended up settling in Egypt, and they weren't really intrusive. They found an area where crops would grow. You know, again, the climate was more hospitable, and they thought, hey, this would be a great place to settle down. So they put down stakes and they start a new life. The problem was the land already belonged to the Egyptians. The Egyptians, though, generally speaking, now keep in mind the Old Testament was written by the descendants of these Hebrews that had settled in Egypt. And while it doesn't become a violent conflict immediately, you have to understand the Egyptians, especially as you get into, I mean, we're pushing right now, this would be Middle Kingdom, maybe going into the second intermediate period, or sorry, not Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom going into the third intermediate period. But the Israelites settle in a portion, in a far corner of the Nile Delta without Egyptian permission. Generally, the Egyptian government was very forgiving. I don't know if I'd go as far as to say welcoming, but the Egyptians were tolerant as long as you abided by their rules, which, for the most part, doesn't really sound that bad. Now, if you come from a foreign territory, if you have a different culture than the Egyptians did, then yes, I could see how it might rub the Hebrews the wrong way. But when push comes to shove, the Hebrews settled in Egyptian territory. Now, as time goes on, again, merchants, because the Egyptian civilization was well established, merchants were coming in and out of Egypt all the time. They had probably come into contact with these non-Egyptians, and as they move farther into the Egyptian kingdom and end up making stops in certain major urban centers, they express that they came into contact with these individuals that obviously aren't Egyptian, but they're living in your backyard. So as government officials are sent out to search out these individuals, the Israelites, they offer them a proposition. They make a proposition. They say, look, it is fine for you to live here in Egypt, but you have to pay taxes. You have to acknowledge the Pharaoh as your king and as your God. The Israelites, they did not consider themselves Egyptian. Therefore, why would they abide by an Egyptian king? They already had their own God. Why would they accept the Pharaoh or accept the Egyptian gods in their God's place? because they refused, they would not bow down to the Pharaoh, they would not accept Egyptian religious ideas. That puts them in direct opposition to the Egyptian government, the Egyptian way of life. And because remember, religion was a part of every aspect of Egyptian life. And that's what's going to lead to, now in the Old Testament, it refers to the Hebrews as slaves, or the slaves of the Pharaoh. Well, I explained that back in chapter 1 when I did the lecture, that by law, everything in Egypt belonged to the Pharaoh. So people might not technically be looked at as slaves, but they were looked at as property of the Pharaoh, the same way that slaves would be owned by another person. The reason that the Israelites were treated more harshly than other Egyptian slaves, the Israelites do get persecuted. They do end up being placed sort of in a slave, or a subservient slave type class, but it's because they refused Egyptian rules. You move into Egypt and you refuse to accept their laws, their traditions, and yes, that's going to cause problems, and that's exactly what happened until eventually Moses ends up leading the Israelites out of Egypt. That's what's referred to in the book of Exodus. Now, between 1200 BC and 1000 BC, you do have the Exodus, where it's 40 years traveling through the desert. Again, I said this, a good chunk of this region on the Eastern Mediterranean is very arid, very rocky. It's not like they were wandering around out in the Arabian desert, farther to the east, but still they escaped from Egypt and they were trying to find the promised land. They were trying to return back to Palestine. And again, numbers are a little fuzzy. All we have historically to go on, as opposed to what's in the Bible, is a lot of times historical accounts of other groups in the region. I mean, everybody, it wasn't like being in Hardinsburg, a small town where everybody knows everybody. But generally, when you have different civilizations, different groups, they've heard of each other, they know of each other. And you have a situation where the Israelites, they escape Egypt, they're moving around, they're trying to find a place to settle. Then finally, around 1000 BC, that's when the Israelites finally find a place to settle, a place to call their own. They begin to establish their own independent kingdom apart from everyone else, and that becomes the kingdom of Israel. Saul was the first king of the Israelites. He ruled for 20 years, from 1020 until 1000 BC. Now, what happens there is Saul's kingdom ends up being destroyed after a struggle with the Philistines, which the Philistines were another coastal group on the Eastern Mediterranean that lived in the same region. Now, the Philistines, they tended to farm. They were more warlike than the Israelites, but don't get me wrong, the Israelites could fight a war with the best of them. The Philistines were also a seafaring people, and what happens is when the Philistines end up deciding that as a society, as a culture, they're not necessarily abandoning the sea, but when they decide that they are going to establish themselves permanently on land, that's where they come into conflict with the Israelites. War breaks out. And of course, this leads to the story of David and Goliath, because Goliath was the greatest warrior among the Philistines. David, by reports, a 15-year-old boy, he ends up taking on, and this wasn't uncommon. You might, if you're familiar with the story of David and Goliath, you might listen to that and think, that's ridiculous. You'd have a 7-foot tall man and a 15-year-old boy fight one-on-one. Well, in the ancient world, at this point in history, it wasn't uncommon for an entire battle to be determined by the outcome of a one-on-one fight. This group ends up sending their most powerful warrior out. This group sends their most powerful warrior out. They fight one-on-one, and whichever side, and generally that would be a fight to the death. But it was a way to conserve resources, human resources, conserve lives, but still, you send your best out, I'll send my best out, and we'll settle this. It didn't mean that the war was over. It just meant that that one particular battle could come to an end with one person dying as opposed to hundreds or thousands of people dying. And that's what happened. It's, when you look at it historically, yes, it makes it entirely believable that two people could square off and that decide an entire battle. Now, that ended up being a very decisive battle. It leads the Israelites to unite behind David, even at the age of 15. And that ends up being the turning of the tide. The Israelites are able to push the Philistines out. They establish control over all of Palestine, and that allows for the kingdom of Israel to continue on in its second iteration after Saul's death. Now, David's son, Solomon, ends up ruling when his father passes away in 970, and Solomon ruled. Saul ruled for 20 years. David rules for 30 years. When David dies, his son Solomon ends up ruling for 40 years. Now, Solomon was best known in the Bible for his wisdom. And of course, being in power for 40 years, he did so much to continue to strengthen his family's power, his kingdom's power, increase his kingdom's borders. He extended political and military establishments, building fortified locations all along his borders, up and down the length of the Mediterranean. He had a reputation on top of his wisdom, on top of being, a strong leader. He expanded the Israelites' trade activities, because that's another thing. In Hebrew society, they did not have a merchant class, but he made connections with foreign merchants, allowed them into his kingdom, and they carried on the commerce with the Israelite people. He also had a reputation as a great builder. He is the one who built the great temple. You hear a lot of times it referred to as Solomon's temple. It was the center, spiritually, politically, for his entire kingdom. Supposedly, it was a storehouse of Jewish relics. Reportedly, that's supposed to have been the resting place of the Ark of the Covenant. After Moses died, the Ark, continued to move on with the Israelite people. And after the temple was completed, the Ark of the Covenant, which was supposed to have housed the Ten Commandments, had come to rest in Solomon's temple. That was believed to be the resting place all the way up until the Crusades. That's one of the things that the European armies Christian armies were looking for, was, they were trying to liberate these, Christian/Jewish relics out of land that was being controlled by Muslims. But that's a story for a different day. After Solomon died, there is a split in how are we going to run the kingdom. Who's going to rule? How are they going to rule? It's not just a political thing. It's also a religious question. Solomon's kingdom ends up dividing into two nations. You had the 12 tribes of Israel. And these were, if I'm not mistaken, the 12 tribes were were started by the descendants of Abraham. The 10 northern tribes, they end up remaining the kingdom of Israel. And you see here on the map, follow the mouse, this orangish yellow kind of sickly color. That is the kingdom of Israel. Now, before Solomon's death, this entire, the yellow and the pink had been the kingdom of Israel. The green you see here in the key, this is the land that belonged to the Philistines, where they had started to push inland towards the Dead Sea. David and his armies had pushed the Philistines, kept them contained on the coast, and they claimed this entire piece of territory. After Solomon's death, the 10 northern tribes, they end up retaining the name of the kingdom of Israel, and down to the south, the 2 southern tribes, they end up becoming the kingdom of Judah. This is where we get the name Jewish from. The people of Judah were referred to as Jews. The people of Israel were referred to as Israelites. But they came from a common society. As time goes on, both of these kingdoms are eventually going to be overrun by other powers from different parts. The Phoenicians, we'll talk about them later. You just get a chance to see here that the Phoenicians, also a seafaring people, they had, the center of their early culture is right here north of the kingdom of Israel. Oh. Now, by the time you get to the end of the 8th century BC, Israel is paying tribute to the Assyrian Empire, which, let me pop back here. The Assyrian Empire, modern day Syria. The Assyrians would have been here off the map, but they would have been north up here in the headwaters of the Euphrates and moving on to the east off of this map. Now, the kingdom of Israel was paying tribute to the Assyrians, which was basically don't punch us in the face money. If you've ever heard of situations, seen stuff in movies, or maybe you've had to deal with bullies yourselves, and you had to give the bully your lunch money to keep them from beating you up every week. That's essentially what the Israelites were doing. Now, Judah didn't have as much of a threat from the Assyrians because the Assyrians were farther north, but they were a next door neighbor of Israel. This goes on for several decades. Like I said, the end of the 9th century BC is going to be the 800s BC. Well, by the time you end up getting to 720 BC, you end up running into a situation where Israel refuses to continue to pay, or they end up having a situation where the payment just isn't enough. They are told to pay, and basically this money is being extorted. If you ever watch mob movies, stuff like this happens where, a thug from the local mob comes into a business and it's referred to as protection money. Well, the protection money is to keep that guy or that group of individuals from tearing up the store or robbing that store, in addition to keeping other groups from hassling the store owner. It was the same thing here. They were paying the Assyrians to protect them, and part of that protection was from the Assyrians themselves. Eventually, it gets to the point where the Assyrians end up attacking Israel. They destroy the capital city in 720 BC. That sets an example for the Judeans. Of course, Israel ends up getting absorbed by the Assyrian Empire. The Judeans end up paying tribute to Assyria from that point forward, but they managed to remain independent. Now, again, and we'll talk about the Assyrians and the Chaldeans and ones like this. With the Chaldeans, the Chaldean Empire, this was another Babylonian empire. When Nebuchadnezzar's Chaldean Empire ends up conquering Judah, because again, the Assyrians are out of the picture, a new group comes into power, the Chaldeans. They're not content with just taking Judah's milk money, so to speak. So they end up invading, they end up crushing Judah. Jerusalem was completely destroyed at 586 BC. Now, the goal here with Nebuchadnezzar was not to completely wipe the Judeans out, but he doesn't just want to take their territory and make it his. He wants the Judeans to adopt Chaldean culture. So what he does, and again, the way that the Hebrews, the way that the Jewish people look at this is much different, because they were picked up, they were forcibly moved against their will, but it's the same thing as saying that the Israelites were the slaves of the Egyptian Pharaoh. Well, they moved into Egyptian territory. They refused to obey Egyptian laws. So yes, they were treated poorly. Here, they were attacked. They were conquered. The upper class, military leaders, political leaders, wealthy families, they were picked up and they were taken to the capital of Babylon. This is looked at very negatively by the Jewish people because it was against their will. And I'm not saying that the Chaldeans were nice. They weren't. But the goal was to get the Judeans, if they could get these powerful, influential Judeans to accept Chaldean rule, Chaldean society, integrate themselves, then it would be easier to get the Judeans back home to accept Chaldean rule. You know, it wasn't that they were taken to Babylon and they were all thrown in prisons. They were allowed jobs. They were allowed to, have nice homes. But it's referred to as the Babylonian captivity because they weren't allowed to leave. 538 BC, the Persians, so the Babylonian captivity lasts for the better part of 50 years. But again, one group rises. When it falls, another group rises and takes its place. When that group falls, another group rises. The Chaldeans end up being at war with the Persians. And in 538 BC, the Persians conquer the Chaldean Empire. The first thing that the Persian ruler does is he allows, once he is informed of the plight of the Israelites, the Judeans, the Hebrews, whatever name you want to call them by, when he's informed of their plight, that they had been held here against their will for 50 years, that's 2 generations minimum. You even have a third young generation that could be coming along by that point. The thing about the Persians is, even though when we talk about the Greeks and Alexander the Great a little later on, even though Alexander the Great was Macedonian, not Greek, the Persians, if you've ever seen the movie 300, the Persians are always painted as the bad guys. The Persians, as an early great civilization, they were much easier to get along with than things like the movie 300 or any Greek histories would paint them as. The Persian ruler ends up hearing about the plight of the Israelite people. He allows them to go home. He allows them to rebuild the city of Jerusalem, rebuild the great temple that Solomon had once built. And all you had to do with the Persians, accept the great king, the emperor, as your ruler. Your local leaders got to retain their titles. They remained local leaders. It's just this king of Israel pledged his allegiance to the great king of Persia. You paid taxes to the great king, and certain Persian laws would need to be enforced, but more often than not, your local laws stayed in place unless they came in direct conflict with a Persian law. You got to keep your laws. You got to keep your culture, your society, your language. You got to keep your religion. They weren't forcing these things on you. As long as you paid your taxes, obeyed the few rules that they gave you, and you accepted the great king of Persia as your king, and if Persia went to war, your kingdom sent soldiers to fight for the great king. That was all that was required of you. That's one of the reasons why the Persian Empire was the greatest empire in the in the Western world for several centuries. Now, Israel, Judah, they end up remaining under Persian control until the conquest of Alexander the Great. When he conquers Persia in 333 BC, that becomes part of his kingdom. But until then, the Israelites had paid tribute to the Assyrians, to the Chaldeans. They end up being absorbed by the Persian Empire, and they lived relatively happily under the Persians for 200 years. And they ended up living under the rule of Alexander the Great for the short period of time that his empire lasted. Judah survived, the people became known as Jews, and their religion becomes known as Judaism. The early Israelites, before the formation of the Jewish faith, and then many, many years down the road, the formation of the Christian faith, Israelites were probably polytheistic, just like all the other cultures that developed in this region. Yahweh was the chief god of Israel. Babylonian exiles in the 6th century BC, they seem to be the first to accept Yahweh, the God of Israel, as the only God. This becomes a true monotheistic religion. The chief source of information about the spiritual conceptions of the Israelite people come from the Hebrew Bible. Now, one of the big focuses you look through, and you look at the Old Testament, and you look at the New Testament as just not as a book of guiding principles, but just as reading material. There are a lot of differences, even in the conception of God, how God acts, how people view God. God of the Old Testament was looked at as, if you defied God, the punishment would be swift and severe. Whereas in the New Testament, God is depicted as, through Jesus's teachings, as much more for, that God is all loving and knowing and forgiving. The focus in the Hebrew Bible is the necessity of the Jews to obey God's law. Because again, if you do not obey God's law or do what God says, punishment can be swift and severe. And it seems like as you go through the Old Testament, every time where someone defies God, that's when something bad happens to the Jewish people. I'm not going to go spend time here talking about the prophets. Again, page numbers that you see here, this would be a heading, the prophets of the Israelites or of the Hebrew people. On 6th edition, that would be on pages 36 and 37 here, just looking in my book. Page 36 and 37, you are looking at talks about the Hebrew prophets in one of the shaded boxed areas. Actually, it would start technically on 35, but you only have a paragraph there, and then it goes into talking about the prophets on, and the heading is the prophets. Social patterns, you had two groups. You had the men of rank and influence, the king's retainers, military officials, government officials, civil officials. They were all servants of the king, but they came from an elevated position. They came from a privileged place in Hebrew society. Then you had the people of the land. You only had two social classes. You were either of the men of rank and influence, or you were the people of the land. People of the land were free people. You had basic civil rights, but there was no merchant class, no commerce, no commerce, no merchants at all. You did have craftsmen, but commerce was all carried on by foreigners. Now, foreign merchants might come in, buy goods from a craftsperson in this village. They go to the next village. They might sell those items off to other Hebrews. But there was not a merchant class within Hebrew society. Family structure, the family was patriarchal, meaning that the father was the head of the household. By Jewish law, the husband or father was considered the master of his wife, possessed the power, and this was, in the story of Abraham in the Old Testament, possessed the power of life and death over his children. One household could contain the mother and father, the husband and wife, and all of their married sons. If they had 7 sons, all of their sons, their wives, their children would live in the household. Daughters left the household when they got married. They entered their husband's household. They became part of their husband's family. Under Hebrew law, kings were limited to 18 wives. 18 wives. Why? Average citizens were allowed to have up to 4 wives. Kings were limited to 18 wives because kings were generally the only ones that could afford to support large harems. Now, you might be, I joke about, why would you want 18 wives? Well, the most important thing, the purpose of the Jewish family or marriage in Jewish society was to have a family. to have children, specifically to have sons, so the family name, so the bloodline could be passed on. With a king, with a noble, it was important to have as many sons as possible, because we're at a point in history where, medicine is not that advanced. If you had a child that made it through the toddler years, they had a relatively good chance of living to adulthood. But infant mortality rate was so high, you wanted to make sure that you had, numerous sons. So if you have, and again, all the blame might be placed on the wife, on the woman, but, the king, it would never be called into question whether he could produce a son. It must have been the wife's fault. So if he has a wife and they have no children, well, she must be barren. Or they have 3 daughters. Well, he would take a second wife, and while his first wife would still be the queen, his primary wife, he would have a second wife. And if she couldn't provide him with a son, he might take a third wife. He might take a fourth wife, on and on and on down the line, up to 18. But generally, once you have 1 or 2 sons, you would stop taking new wives. Wasn't always the case, but that's generally what happened. Citizens would be limited to 4, but they would still be allowed to take on multiple wives because of the importance of having a son, so you could pass on the family name, so the bloodline could continue. It was most common for Hebrew men to just take 1 wife. It's not like, oh, this is a law, so everybody has multiple wives. No, that was not the case. The law was there so someone could take multiple wives if the need was there to have a male heir. Generally, Hebrew men only married 1 woman. That was their wife, and they stayed together. Women, even though they were looked at as servants, servants of their father until they got married, then they became servants of their husband, they were still highly valued. The household could not run if it were not for the wife, if it was not for the wife/mother and daughters. And then it's bad, but daughters were highly prized, because when your daughter married into another family, that was a way to build connections for the father, for the head of the household. It was a way to honestly enrich the head of the household, because the husband paid a dowry. Not in Hebrew society, but generally what you saw is, when marriages were arranged, the groom's family would pay a dowry to the bride's family. Now, marriages were arranged, but the Hebrews did not use dowries. But still, by arranging the marriages, you could strengthen bonds between 2 families. You could create new bonds between families. That, if a man marries his daughter into a higher class family, then while this family would still be higher ranking than this family, it would elevate the importance of the bride's family, because now they're connected to this more powerful family. The groom, the groom would pay the bride's father. The best way we could explain it today is for the loss of a daughter, because again, women in the family were highly valued. So the groom paid the father of the bride because he was losing a daughter. She was not part of his family anymore. When a woman left her father's house and got married, she became part of the groom's family. Sons were prized over daughters because they carried on the family name, they carried on the bloodline. Daughters would end up eventually leaving the home Whereas sons would stay, they would carry on the family line, they would carry on the family business. When the father died, the oldest son, the oldest brother, would become the head of the family. The younger brothers would be allowed. And that's another thing, is that they didn't just live in the same household until the father died. The father might tell this son or this son or this son, you're ready to move out and start your own. The household, the family would stay closely connected, but they didn't necessarily have to stay in the home until their father passed away. They could be granted the opportunity to go out and start their own household. But sons, they were more highly prized because they would stay and carry on the family line. Now, I'm going to stop there. We will pick up with the neighbors of the Israelites later in a new video. Let me stop presenting there. I will go ahead and start recording part 2 in just a little bit here. I don't know if I will post it on the same day. I might hold on to it and post it next week. We'll see.